Hello, everybody. This is Mr. Ansharsky, AP World History, coming back at you again with Chapter 9 of Unit 7. Today, we're going to talk about the rise of fascism in Europe, mostly in Italy and in Germany. But your bell work is on the screen. What comes to mind when you hear the word dictator? Don't say me. So like I said, this is going to be our introduction into what fascism is and how it's going to rise in places like Italy and Germany. Lesson objective today is explain the causes and consequences of the Second World War. You're going to focus on Europe. Just before we continue, I want to get some terminology out of the way. So we are going to talk a lot about this spectrum right here between the left and the right. And we've kind of danced around this before, but let's get into it. What exactly do we mean by these terms? Well, left wing, we've talked about some ideologies that relate to this. We've talked about socialism and communism and anarchism. It really is based a lot on the idea of economic collectivism, the idea of having a anti-capitalist society in some sort. It's promoting class equality, that class conflict is necessary to get to this class equality, limited private property, they tend to be secular. And we've talked about a bit more of a moderate position, and that is liberalism, the idea of being in favor of capitalism, the idea of being in favor of, at least to a degree, some political freedoms, for instance, the right to vote. A lot of liberal countries, as we've seen, are democracies, or they are constitutional republics, more accurately. So representative democracy, pro-capitalism, that's what liberalism is about. And it's in this kind of center between the left and the right. But today we're going to talk a lot about the right wing. The right is going to be defined by the idea that hierarchy is a good thing, that authority is a good thing. It's very much in favor of those ideas of social Darwinism that we've been talking about ad nauseum. So right-wing thinkers tend to stress traditionalism, they tend to stress extreme nationalism and patriotism. Sometimes ideas of racial superiority will make their way in there. And in general, more authoritarian, in general, more traditional, in general, definitely socially conservative. And we're going to talk about an extremely far right idea of all of this, and that is fascism, something that will emerge largely in opposition to communism, which is a left-wing idea. But let's take a look at the ideas of fascism. That's what this presentation is all about, after all. Well, let's just define what we mean by it. Well, it is a far right, it is a authoritarian and ultra-nationalist ideology, one that stresses the superiority of one's nation over others, one that stresses the necessity of having a strong government, often in the hands of a single person, a dictator. So as such, fascism is very much defined by its anti-democratic ideas. It is very much against economic and political liberalism, but it is also deeply opposed to Marxism, deeply opposed to communism and socialism. So fascism is largely going to emerge in opposition to communism, in opposition to the successful communist revolution in Russia, for example. So we'll talk about the distinction because we have talked about authoritarian leaders before, especially Stalin. But what makes a fascist unique? Well, it really is this idea of being opposed to Marxism, whereas Stalin is an interpretation of Marxism. So fascists are going to position themselves as not completely pro-capitalism, not completely laissez-faire capitalism, but they certainly are opposed to the idea of class equality. They are opposed to the notion of abolishing all classes that Marxism wants to stress. So they're going to position themselves in what fascists call a third position, or third way, it's sometimes called. It's not liberal democracy, it's not liberal capitalism, but it certainly isn't communism. So the kind of solution to this is an economic idea known as corporatism. It's the idea that we organize society through these big interests, especially major economic corporations, economic conglomerates. So really, corporatism is going to see a very close relationship between big business and the government. We'll talk about the relationship between German industries and the Nazi government when we talk about that later on. So corporatism is with the intention of having some sort of cooperation between different classes. Classes are good, according to fascists, but there needs to be social cohesion. So corporatism is going to see state interference between that conflict between workers and factory owners, the bourgeoisie. So corporatism is stressing against class conflict. That's really what you should take away from that. The association between big business and authoritarian governments. That's what defines fascism. It's what defines corporatism. And as I mentioned, fascists believe that a strong government is necessary. It's necessary to reduce friction in society, especially class friction. And as I mentioned kind of before, with this far right idea is this insistence on traditionalism, this insistence on appealing to some time when a country was great. In Italy, you have to go back to the Roman Empire, which is a little sad in my opinion, because you have to go all the way back to 100 CE, but that's regardless. The idea I was trying to express is this appeal to when a country was quote unquote great, when it was stable, when it was strong, when it was an international force to be reckoned with. For Italy, as I mentioned, it's the Roman Empire. For the Nazis, it's going to be either the Second German Reich that we've talked about, or really the Holy Roman Empire. So the appeal to traditionalism, especially social conservatism, especially this imagined nationalist past, is very much a factor of fascism. We're going to see fascists around the world, not just in Germany and Italy, but we'll see them pop up in Latin America, in Spain, in China, under Chiang Kai-shek, and in Japan as well. That's what we'll talk about next presentation. But why would someone appeal towards fascism? Well, we're going to break that down historically. Why is fascism going to emerge by the end of the First World War? Well, really, we have World War I to blame for the rise of fascism. Because World War I is an extremely pivotal event in world history. It is what we call a watershed moment. It really is birthing the 20th century. It's bringing an end to the aristocracy that we talked about in our last presentation at this point. It's bringing about this new social order where we no longer have the traditional class or gender hierarchies that we've had since really the French Revolution. So remember, World War I, we have female workers in factories. We have minorities in factories. We have minorities serving in colonial armies. And remember, those colonial armies, where were they shipped to? They were shipped to Europe. So we're seeing in the minds of a lot of conservative voices, the breakdown of tradition, the breakdown of hierarchy. We're seeing these new crazy ideas of jazz and female suffrage. It's all a little too much for a lot of conservative figures in Europe. But on top of that, it's very concerning because look at what World War I was about. No one really knows why this war happened, but they certainly know that millions of young men were killed. And all of this is a huge mistrust in traditional liberal governments. So we have this fear of social progressivism. We have this fear of political modernity in the form of liberalism. But we also have the fear of communism. I mean, in 1917, the Bolsheviks successfully took over the government in Russia. They turned it into the Soviet Union. And there are some legitimate fears of communism. I mean, certainly Stalin's interpretation of that. We saw his mass repression of his former allies, the repression of Russian and other Soviet workers. But there's also a middle class fear of communism. Remember, communism, no private property. What do middle class people like? They like private property. So there is going to be not only this mistrust in the way things have been going so far in traditional liberalism, but also mistrust and fear of communism. And this very much, these two ideas blend together in this anger towards religious and ethnic minorities that we're going to see by the end of the First World War, really building upon already existing ideas of racial hierarchies, of racial prejudice, of religious prejudice. And certainly it's going to be intensified, as I said, by this new debate concerning modernity and this fear of communism. There's this fear of upsetting the traditional white middle class. And it's really coming from a few sources. For one thing, it's the introduction of quote unquote degenerate music. That's what the Nazis will refer to things like jazz. Degenerate culture is what the Nazis referred to by these ideas of modern social progressivism. So you see in this poster right here, it expresses this fear, quote unquote, of muddying up the white gene pool, as the Nazis and other fascists would put it. But you also have this targeting, hyper-specific targeting, oftentimes, of Jews. Jews are, of course, going to be the large victim of the Nazi regime when they get to power. Jews are blamed not only for the traditional excesses, quote unquote, of liberal capitalism, of high loans, of high interest rates for loans because of the negative association between Jews and banking. But there's also the association, imagined association of Jews and communism. A lot of fascists are going to point out that Karl Marx and his family, they were Jewish. Well, Marx wasn't, he was an atheist, and his dad converted to Lutheranism. But regardless, there is going to be this association between Judaism, between communism. And you can see that in this poster right here. It says in German, Bolshevism without its mask. And what's under the mask? It is the Star of David. And this very much blends into this kind of ultimate form of nationalism referred to as ethno-nationalism. The idea that nationhood belongs only to a certain ethnic identity, a very limited definition of that national identity. For German ultranationalists, it's Germans. It's Germans who practice Protestantism. It's Germans who aren't Catholic. It's Germans who aren't Jewish. It's Germans who embody those traditional, quote unquote, ideas of German ethnicity. The quote unquote blonde hair, blue eyed sort of figure. So ethno-nationalism is this extreme form of nationalism, extremely exclusive of what it means to have a national identity. So this is going to be a major component of fascism by the start of the 20th century, and really until today. In many ways, fascism is justified pseudoscientifically by social Darwinism, the idea of the survival of the fittest and its racial and class implications that we've talked about before. But fascists are appealing to a very broad group of people because they're promising stability. Remember, post-World War I, Europe is in chaos. Germany has a little communist revolution that fails, but it's enough to terrify people. It's enough for people to say, we want order. And really, that's coming from all classes of people. We want order to solve economic problems. For instance, the Great Depression. We want order to crack down on communists. So the promise of stability that fascists bring is really going to be a major reason why fascists will gather a following, and they will be successful in Germany and Italy. But the image I have right here, they're British fascists. So it's not just a German or Italian movement. But how do fascists get people to their side? How do they promote their crazy, wacky ideas? Well, they're going to do that by appealing to those fears, to those emotions, to those promises of a glorious future. And they're going to express that in a variety of different ways, in something we call political theater. In many ways, fascists are theater kids. That was a bad joke, I'm sorry. Anyway, what is political theater? Well, essentially, it is this idea of appealing to innate emotions to support an ideological cause. You have a lack of purpose. Well, I'll give you a purpose through nationalism, through this idea of ethno-nationalism, through this idea of authoritarianism. So this is going to be especially expressed in these huge speeches fascists will give, in these rallies that they'll hold, in parades. There's very much a militant atmosphere at a fascist parade, and you can see that in the images right there. So the notion of militarism and the notion of appealing towards common concerns of hunger, fears, of losing social order. That's going to be a major theme expressed in these speeches, in these rallies, in these parades. And in many ways, fascist propaganda is inescapable. And that's because fascists are going to utilize those trends we talked about by the end of the 19th and start of the 20th century. Things like mass communication. Fascists will get on the radio. They'll get into movie houses. They'll show clips basically advertising their cause. Advertisement is a way fascists are appealing to people. And it's making it so you know what they're all about. And they're promising something in return for getting into power. And oftentimes fascists are going to be identified by common symbols. The word fascism itself comes from the phrase, or excuse me, the word fasces, which is a Latin word. Fasces, essentially a bundle of sticks. One stick weak, one stick goes with other stick, makes strong. You can't break it. That was there was an easier way to say that. Essentially, it's that giving a purpose through national unity. That's what a fasces is. But we're also going to see how fascist parties will commonly identify themselves. The use of the fasces is common, but we have other specific examples. We have the swastika. The swastika, of course, will be utilized by the Nazis, but it is going to also appeal to this idea of racial superiority, especially the idea of an imagined past when things were good. Nazis are going to say that they're the Aryans, that they're the descendants of people that lived in India thousands of years ago. It makes no sense. But why did I say that? Well, it expresses this notion of an idealized past, but it's expressed through this symbol right here because a swastika, in its original origins, is a Hindu and Buddhist symbol. It has nothing to do with the fascists, with the Nazis. But it's appealing to that idea of an imagined past when things were good. But why aren't things good right now? Well, fascists are going to identify a common enemy, a scapegoat group, if you will. Most fascists will blame communists, But as we'll talk about with the Nazis, Jews are going to be the quote unquote common enemy of the German people. In many ways, fascist parties are organized around this central idea of authoritarianism. And as such, the party organization itself is going to reflect that. It's going to be very militant in its structure. The dictator, so to say, is going to sort of be the person that the party revolves around. It's very much like a military, the general, and all of their supporters, their soldiers. And this is going to not only be expressed in the party bureaucracy itself, but also in the secret police and private armies, paramilitary organizations. We'll see this in Italy with the black shirts, with the Nazis. We'll see it with the SA, and we'll also see with the SS. In China, we'll see it with the blue shirts. I forgot to mention the Nazis also called their paramilitary groups brown shirts. Fascists are really interested in colored shirts, apparently. But the secret police and private army, very much a component of fascism. On top of this, like I said, you have all party identity revolving around the dictator, around the party leader. And we call this a cult of personality, the notion that everything in a party revolves around one individual. And very much fascism is an example of totalitarianism. And what is totalitarianism? It essentially is going to be total control of the state, of government, over everything, socially, politically, and economically. So fascism is an example of this. Remember, it's giving people a common purpose in exchange for absolute power. But we've talked about authoritarian leaders before, especially in this unit. We talked about Stalin in chapter 6. But it's important to identify how these guys are different, how Stalinism is different from fascism. They're both authoritarian, they both have cults of personality, they both aren't liberal democracies, they both have a secret police and a common enemy. They both have this idea of economic self-sufficiency or autarky. But how are they different? Well, Stalinism is Marxism. I should say, it is an interpretation of Marxism. Obviously, there are Marxists that don't agree with Stalin, but in the end, Stalinism is promising this notion of class equality. And we achieve that through class conflict. Stalinism is a rejection of social Darwinism. And it's also a left-wing ideology, as opposed to fascism being a right-wing ideology. Fascism is based on social Darwinism. It is in favor of large corporations through corporatism, and it is deeply opposed to Marxism. Remember, fascists, they are seeking that third way between liberal democracy and communism. What's the solution? Fascism. So you should be able to identify what fascism is, what fascism is, and you should also be identifying what concerns fascism seeks to address historically. We're going to look now at how fascism rises in places like Italy, Germany, and Spain, mostly focusing on Italy and Germany. Let's first go to Bibbidi Boppidi land. Let's go to Italy. Well, let's just build up some context, because fascism is going to emerge in 1919, roughly a year or so after World War I ends. But we can we can trace the roots of fascism to World War I. Well, why is that? Well, World War I is very unpopular in Italy. It's seen as this kind of, the monarch, the king and the parliament. They're just doing this not in the interests of the Italian people. There's not going to be a very effective campaign by the Italian government to encourage mass support for World War I. And after all, the Italians aren't going to get much in World War One. They fight over that territory in Austria where ethnic Italians live, but the Italians don't even get it. So Italians fight and suffer and die, everyday Italians, and nothing to show for it, other than millions of young men dead. There was a battle, a series of battles, I should say, in Italy during the First World War, in the border between Italy and Austria, the Battle of Ianza. And there were 12 different ones of these battles. And really, the only result was a lot of people dying. So World War One and the failure to gain significant territory and this failure to mobilize nationalism is a major reason why we are going to see an appeal towards fascism. It's a major reason why we see a rise in irredentism. Remember, irredentism, the notion that there is rightful property, rightful land for a country. So we have all of these dead people, but the returning soldiers, they're not going to have any jobs. So we have massive unemployment. On top of that, we have economic tensions within Italy. Italy is kind of forced to rapidly industrialize to support themselves in the First World War. And the rapid industrialization that we've seen in other places causes a lot of social tension, especially between workers and factory owners. We're going to see a rise in left-wing activism in Italy following the First World War. And who is concerned about this? Well, it's the middle class. It's people who hate communists and hate socialists. So it's in this environment of economic problems, of political instability, that we are going to see calls for change, both from the left and the right. And who emerges from the right wing? It's going to be this guy right here, Benito Mussolini. Mussolini was a veteran of the First World War. At one point, he was a socialist, but then he kind of got disillusioned with it. And he's going to go to the opposite side of the spectrum. He is going to become a major right-wing thinker in Italy, very much opposed to communism, very much opposed to this apparent put down of Italian nationalism by not giving us the land we rightfully deserve. So we are going to see, especially among returning World War I veterans, that will be important when we talk about Germany, that we're going to see this mass movement start to emerge among the political right. And Mussolini is going to lead this charge. He is going to oversee the creation of a fascist party referred to as the Nationalist Party, the National Fascist Party. So in 1919, a conglomeration of different right-wing groups who hate communism, they're going to get together under Mussolini, and we're going to have the fascist party emerge in Italy. And the fascists, well, they're advocating for the usual stuff. They're advocating for an opposition to communism. They're advocating for a strong central government. But the fascists are also saying we have to solve this unemployment crisis. So there is an appeal towards both the middle and the working class. That's kind of the theme that we're going to get to going on. But the communists, they're also doing pretty good in Italy. So how do the fascists discourage support for the communists? Well, they're going to form their own paramilitary organization, a secret army, so to say, the Black Shirts. The Black Shirts, they are going to be basically street thugs. They're going to do things like voter intimidation. They're going to do things like breaking up Communist Party rallies. They'll firebomb Communist Party offices. So really, they're a threatening force to people who are on the fence about this whole fascism thing. Well, maybe I was going to vote for the communists in the election, but then you look around and you see a black shirt standing over your shoulder. You don't want your family to get beat up. So who do you vote for? Well, you vote for anybody but the communists. You vote for the fascists. So the threat of street violence is going to be a major reason why we see this support for fascism in Italy. And to counter all of this, well, the left isn't going to take this sitting down. They're going to form their own paramilitary organizations. There's going to be massive amounts of strikes in Italy. And all of this is going to play into the hands of the fascist strategy. Because in 1921, there's an election coming around. And you have fascists attacking communists. The communists resist, so there's violence in the streets. You have still this problem of unemployment. So we are going to still see political instability. And the fascists are going to ride this coattail and be voted into office. But the problem with a parliamentary government, a multi-party government, is that there are a lot of parties to compete against. And even though the fascists in 1921 make a pretty good showing, they don't have absolute power. So, how are they going to achieve this absolute power? Well, in 1922, there's going to be a massive rally held, 60,000 black shirts, all led by Mussolini, some carrying guns, some carrying weapons. They're going to march on the capital of Italy, Rome, and they're going to say, we'll commit a coup if you don't give Mussolini the position as prime minister. And out of the fear of this violence, and out of the fear of the communists perhaps somehow coming to power, the government is going to say, okay, Mussolini is leader now. He is the prime minister. But still, even though he is the prime minister, the fascists still don't have absolute power. But that's going to change really quickly once Mussolini comes to power. Because a few years later, citing the instability of the political situation, all elections are going to be outlawed. So in 1925, the fascists are going to be the only legal party in Italy. So we have an absolute dictatorship established. Political freedoms are restricted. Communists and other opponents to the fascists, they're sent to concentration camps, to prison camps. We have the outlawing of political parties other than the fascists, as I said. We have the outlawing of groups that could be potentially subversive to the fascists, like the Boy Scouts. We have a restriction on political freedoms, the censoring of the press, and all power is in the hands of Mussolini. Mussolini adopts this title called the Duce, the dictator of Italy, and he's going to massively promote this absolute government control over every institution through a mass propaganda campaign. Mussolini is filling positions in government with his fascist allies, and they have absolute control over every aspect of the Italian government. They have control over education programs. You see right here, this is a textbook. The translation roughly summarized is, we are pledging absolute support to Mussolini, and the principles of this book, they are dedicated to the principles of fascism. We have this propaganda campaign, as I said. We have this poster right here. It is saying essentially, greet or salute the Duce, Mussolini. He is the founder of the new Italian empire. We have these massive rallies being held to gain legitimacy. Mussolini is apparently a great speaker. We also have an alliance being formed with the Catholic Church. How do we gain legitimacy? Well, let's buddy up with the big religious institution of Italy, the Catholics. So on top of this complete government control, this social influence as well, we also have how Mussolini is directing economic policy. He is going to favor those middle-class people who brought him to power. He is going to very much have a close association between big business and his government. We have corporatism. He's going to privatize a lot of industries, essentially let them do whatever they want in exchange for their support. But thank God he's not a communist, am I right? But how is Mussolini appealing to the working class? Because when he is giving these corporations absolute power to do what they want in their workplaces, and even though he's outlawing labor unions, Mussolini is going to make appeals to working class concerns. He is going to initiate a lot of government programs through remilitarization. We have massive employment efforts to industrialize and remilitarize Italy. So we're going to have this mass employment campaign that's very much going to be popular with working class people who have been out of jobs since the end of World War I. But securing things at home, Italy is going to try and establish that Roman Empire that they kept talking about so much. Mussolini is famously going to say that he wants to turn the Mediterranean into the Italian lake. And as such, we are going to see a very aggressive and militant foreign policy. In 1935, Italy is going to invade Ethiopia, one of the last countries not occupied by European colonies. Ethiopia is going to be invaded. The Italians used mustard gas and other poison gas against the Ethiopians. And all the while, the international community, even though they're going to tut Mussolini, the League of Nations is not going to do anything about it. The League of Nations says, no, Mussolini, stop it. What does Mussolini do? He pulls out of the League of Nations. So we have little to really stop the Italians. And they're kind of riding high. They're going to say, we're doing really good for ourselves. And we are forming that empire we've talked so much about. But what if we need allies? So in 1936, Italy is going to enter in an alliance with other authoritarian governments, with the Nazis in Germany, with the militant government in Japan. And this is going to be the Axis that we'll talk about more in the Second World War. So you should be able to identify how Mussolini rose to power and how is he an example of a fascist, other than the fact he's in the fascist party. So we're going to turn our attention now to Spain for a real quick second, because it is also an example of how fascists are coming to power. Well, let's do a real crash course on Spanish history, because the last time we talked about Spain was like the colonies. So what's going on in Spain? Well, Spain's really going to stay a monarchy, a kind of backward conservative monarchy until the 1930s, until 1931, with the establishment of the Spanish Republic. The Republic is going to be not communist, but it is definitely sympathetic towards the left wing. You have socialists in the ruling coalition, the Popular Front, and this is kind of upsetting to the people that supported the monarchy. It's very much upsetting to the middle classes who are opposed to socialist programs that the Popular Front is putting up. So, to resist the Spanish Republic, we are going to see the rise of fascists. These fascists are going to be inspired by Mussolini. They're going to be made up of the Spanish nobility, of the Spanish middle classes, especially the Spanish military, which has both of those groups. And one of the military leaders that comes to prominence in this new fascist organization is this guy right here, Francisco Franco. Franco is going to be the party leader of the new fascist party, the Falange, and he's going to try and do a coup against the Republican government. It's not going to work out at first, but eventually we are going to see a mass uprising of these Spanish fascists against the Republican government. The fascists are often referred to as the nationalists, and this conflict between the nationalists and the Republicans is known as the Spanish Civil War. So we have the fascists under Franco, their political symbol right here, against the left-leaning government in Spain, the Republicans. Left-leaning Republicans. Anyway, well, because the United, never mind. But the nationalists are going to have help. They are going to have help from other fascist organizations, from other fascist countries. Germany and Italy, they are going to supply the nationalist movement against the Republican government. And even though the rest of the world is kind of concerned, I guess, that there's a civil war going on in Europe between Spanish nationalists and Spanish fascists, or Spanish Republicans, really, no one's really going to support this left-leaning government other than the Soviet Union and Mexico. So the Soviet Union is going to send military aid to support the Republican government, whereas the Germans, they're sending aid to help the fascists, to help the nationalists. So this kind of atmosphere of this ideological war between fascism and communism, in many ways, it's the dress rehearsal for the Second World War. That's typically the phrase used by historians. And a lot of the military strategies that we are going to see in the Second World War are going to be first utilized in the Spanish Civil War. So the Spanish Civil War, not only a representation of how fascism can come to power in places, but definitely the use of new military strategies in warfare, because there's been a lot of technological improvements since the First World War, and they're being utilized first in places not only like Spain, but Ethiopia as well. One of the worst examples of how this military technology is being utilized, especially against civilians, is going to be the bombing of Guernica. Guernica was a town, or is a town, it still exists, in the north of Spain. It was controlled by the Republicans. But thanks to German airplanes, the town is going to be completely leveled. It is complete destruction of the town, utilizing these new military strategies. And I'm going to show some pictures of what that looks like, because we talked about bombings in the First World War, but they're not as extreme as what we're going to see in the Second World War. And all of this starts with Guernica. Spoiler alert, the fascists are going to win, unfortunately. The nationalists win the Spanish Civil War. Franco becomes the dictator, the caudillo of Spain. And he's going to be in power really until the 70s. He's not going to get involved in the Second World War. He's not going to have an alliance. He's not going to join the Axis Pact between the Nazis and the Italians. And because of this, he's going to stay in power until he dies in the 70s. He actually gets support from the United States because, after all, he is not a communist. The pictures I have here are kind of the atrocities of Francisco Franco and the Nazis and the fascists, I should say, in Spain. This image right here is the town of Guernica after it's completely bombed out by the Nazis and the Spanish fascists. When Franco comes to power, he is going to institute a lot of the same repressions that Italy and the Nazis did. We're going to see the mass execution of political opponents, of communists. The image I have right here is a mass grave of communists found after the death of Francisco Franco. And the image I have right here is the liberation of a concentration camp in Germany that housed Spanish communists. So very much this close association between rabid anti-communism and this authoritarian right-wing government. The image I have right here is also a very famous one. This is a painting by Pablo Picasso. It shows the absolute chaos of the city of Guernica after the bombing by the Germans and the Spanish fascists. It's a very famous image if you haven't seen it before. So talking about Italy and Spain, we're going to turn our attention to Germany because boy, oh boy, this is where fascism is going to thrive. But how does fascism come about? Well, let's first take a look at the context. Let's talk about the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic, I introduced this when we talked about the Great Depression. It's the government that immediately forms after the First World War. It is going to be a liberal democracy. It is going to be without the Kaiser. The Kaiser actually abdicated Wilhelm II. He fled to the Netherlands and he stayed there until he died in the 40s. So this is going to be really Germany's first experiment with liberal democracy, with a truly liberal democracy. And as such, we're going to see actually kind of a expansion of political and social freedoms that we really didn't have before then. We're going to see mass elections being held. The Communist Party makes a resurgence, but they're actually legal now. We're going to see this blending of gender and racial and I lost my train of thought. This blending of gender and racial lines as well. We're going to see acceptance for LGBT people. This is actually a time when we see great research, medical and sociological, into LGBT concerns and issues. So we have this economically and politically liberal society. And this is all very concerning for those that want to remain traditional, for traditionalists in Germany, especially the middle class. But you have this blending of already assumed racial and gender lines. But on top of that, there's going to be an undercurrent of nationalism in the Weimar Republic, especially after the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the Treaty of Versailles stipulated a few things for Germany. Germany had to give up a lot of land within Europe and all of their colonies. They had to pay reparations. And kind of pettiest of all, in my opinion, is that Germany had to take full responsibility for the war. And that's a huge slap in the face for German nationalists, especially for people who are returning home from the war, for German veterans. There's going to be a huge amount of political disillusionment within Weimar Republic, not only against the government that was forced to accept the Treaty of Versailles, the Weimar Republic, but also against democracy itself. Things were better when the Kaiser was in charge. Things were better when we had a system, a society where people knew their place, where there was established hierarchies. And even though there is going to be initial economic instability, we talked about that with the Great Depression for a little bit and the post-war period. There is going to be a time, thanks to loans essentially from the American banks through the Dawes Plan, that there is going to be some degree of economic stability. We are going to see the so-called Golden 20s emerge. And to greet the Golden 20s, we have a lovely guest right here. Hello, Harold. So the Golden 20s is this time period of economic stability, of economic prosperity even. We see the middle class expand greatly during this time. And yet, all of that is going to come crashing down with the Great Depression. We talked about this before. Remember, American loans were necessary for economic stability. It'd be a shame if those banks who gave out those loans were to collapse, and that they did. That's what triggered the Great Depression. We're going to see a resurgence of hyperinflation. So immediately after the First World War, there was hyperinflation to try and pay for all this stuff. And really, hyperinflation is going to absolutely devastate a lot of the economic growth in Germany. By the start of World War I, the German mark, the German currency, was about 50 marks to $1 US. But by 1918, by the really the end of World War I and the start of the Weimar Republic, $1 US is worth 15 million German marks. So there is absolute economic chaos. It gets a little better during the Golden 20s with those loans from the Americans, but when all of that dries up in the Great Depression, that's going to send huge shockwaves across Germany. And this is going to greatly impact the middle and working class in Germany. We are going to see people emerging who are opposed to this liberal democracy, who are opposed to the government that let this happen through free market capitalism. And that is going to be the rise of not only the Communist Party, but also the Nazis. The communists kind of had an establishment, at least their position in Germany was real ever since the German Revolution in 1918. But out of this middle class concern for the communists, we're going to see the rise of the Nazis. The Nazis really have their origin during the German Revolution in many ways. The Weimar governments, in putting down this revolution, they are going to form organizations of veterans of the First World War, of ultra-nationalist veterans who hate communism, and they're going to form groups called the Freikorps. These essentially are right-wing militias that are used to put down the communist revolution, but it's going to be the basis for right-wing politics in Germany, because a lot of these Freikorps veterans, and a lot of veterans of World War I in particular, they are going to be the leaders of fascist parties, and the most important for us is Adolf Hitler. Hitler was an Austrian-born veteran of the First World War. He moved to Germany in his youth, and he got really involved in German nationalism. German nationalism, not even once. But Hitler is going to be very much focused on this notion of militancy, of German nationalism, and he is going to also be deeply opposed to communism. He blames communists and socialists, who he thinks are mostly Jews, for Germany's defeat in the First World War. So Hitler is going to form an organization, a political party called the Nazi Party. It is an acronym for the National Socialist German Workers' Party. We'll talk more about their beliefs in just a second. But the National Socialist German Workers' Party is kind of a vague term. It's okay. It's kind of a vague term because it appeals to kind of two different groups of people in Germany. It appeals to workers because the Nazis are promising full employment. They're promising, it's okay. They're promising full employment through kind of socialist welfare programs. So that's cool for working class people who don't have jobs during the Great Depression. But they're also going to focus in on this idea of German nationalism and the opposition to communism. Who likes that? It's the German middle class. So we have this appeal to different groups of people. How else are the Nazis an example of fascism? Well, they're going to form a paramilitary organization known as the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, or the brown shirts as they're sometimes called. And much like the black shirts, the Sturmabteilung, they are going to initiate a terror campaign against left-wing activists in Germany. They are going to break up communist rallies. They're going to firebomb and sometimes murder communist leaders and their political offices. So this SA is an example, again, of that fascist paramilitary organization. But unlike Mussolini, Hitler is going to try and stage a coup. And I should have said, this coup is very similar to Mussolini's plan in the March on Rome, but it's not going to be successful. So in 1923, thinking he has the support of a huge majority of people, there is going to be an attempted coup in the beer hall putsch, or coup, essentially. That's what a putsch is. This is going to be put down by the Weimar Republic, and Germany is not going to see really the role of the fascists in government at all. And Hitler is arrested, and a lot of the other Nazi party leaders, they're also arrested. But in jail, you're going to see how Hitler is going to solidify the beliefs of the Nazis. Because the Nazis have a very kind of vague political position. They're authoritarian, don't get me wrong, but there are some people who are stressing the more socialist part of the Nazi acronym. There are people who are stressing the more nationalist part of it. And that is going to be clarified and solidified in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle in Germany. And in the book, Hitler is going to outline what he believes and what the Nazi political organization is all about. Well, for one thing, he is going to focus on intense opposition to communism. He's going to say we need to remilitarize Germany so that we can provide jobs for people. But he's also going to infuse it with language of nationalism. He's going to say things like, there is rightful German territory that we were stolen from by the Treaty of Versailles. We need to reclaim German land, and we also need to have more land for Germany, land with German speakers, even if it didn't originally belong to Germany. But on top of this, Hitler is going to outline his ideas of racial superiority. He is going to classify different groups of people into categories. Ethnic Germans are the so-called Aryan race. They are the white people of England and Scandinavia and Germany. He's really into Nazis. I shouldn't say that about Harold, he's a good cat. So he has this vision of racial superiority, this idea that Aryans should control Germany. He's classifying other groups of people as inferior to the Aryans, especially Slavic people, people from Eastern Europe, people from Italy, funnily enough, people from France. They are considered quote unquote degenerate races. He's going to say that Slavic people are only really fit for slave labor and that they are occupying land that should belong to ethnic Germans. But he's going to save most of his vitriol for Jews. Hitler is going to specify his hatred of Jews, that they are responsible for basically everything wrong in Germany. They were responsible for the defeat in World War I, according to Hitler. He's going to hyper specify on Jewish politicians, of socialists who happen to be Jewish. He's going to specify that a cabal of Jewish bankers caused the Great Depression, that another cabal of Jewish people, they successfully led the communist revolution in Russia, and they were the agitators of the communist revolution in Germany. And really, as this is all really crazy stuff, I hope you agree with me there. And in many ways, a lot of Germans agreed with me too, that this is all extremist stuff. We don't need to be this extremist. And yet, everything is going to change when the Great Depression rolls around. We are going to see calls for stability. We are going to see middle-class fears of the success of the Communist Party. We are going to see working class people who are extremely upset about unemployment. We're going to see this fear of the breakdown of the social order. So the Nazis are promising to return Germany to make it, I don't want to say the phrase that I'm going to say, but sort of make it, better again, one could say. And the Nazis, they are going to stress this through their political party's platform. They are going to appeal to the working class by saying, we're going to solve the unemployment issue. We're going to remilitarize, provide mass employment opportunities for a great majority of Germans. We're going to do that through remilitarizing, but also building up the infrastructure in Germany. The poster right here, it says, work, freedom, and bread, vote the National Socialists. That's what they're promising working class Germans. But to the middle class, they're promising a return to stability, a return to that gender and racial hierarchy. You see that expressed right here. This poster right here depicts the quote unquote perfect German Aryan family, all protected by the loving arms of the Nazi Party's symbol in the eagle. But the Nazis are also appealing to the middle class, so to say, in their intense opposition to communism. This poster right here says, a fight for Germany. The orderly Nazis, they are contrasted with those rabble-rousing communists. They're going to promote German nationalism by saying we need to repeal the Treaty of Versailles, we need to take over rightful German territory, we need to reclaim Germany's greatness. And very much present throughout Nazi party campaigning is going to be their ideas of racial superiority. If it isn't explicit, then it certainly is implied. We're going to see that expressed in Nazi party publications, at least the explicit anti-Semitism. This poster right here, or this political cartoon, I should say, it depicts a Jewish man sitting on a bag of money, again appealing to these anti-Semitic tropes about Jews and their relation to big business, which isn't founded, obviously. So the Nazis are promising these different things right here. And I think that can kind of be expressed in this political cartoon. This was made by an anti-Nazi, so someone who was opposed to the Nazis. And it kind of shows how the Nazis have these different strategies of appealing to different classes. Because on the one hand, they're promising workers' programs, they're promising government welfare programs, they're promising to solve the unemployment issue. And yet, at the same time, they're appealing to the middle class. They're emphasizing German nationalism. They're emphasizing the opposition to communism. So you should be able to identify what the Nazis believed, how they appealed to different classes in Germany. So when the Great Depression rolls around, suddenly the Nazis don't seem so crazy because the communists are a very real threat. And these liberal Democrats, they failed Germany. They failed by allowing this depression to happen. So in 1932, there's going to be a Reichstag election. There's going to be an election in the German parliament. And the Nazis, they make an okay showing. It's not bad. Well, I mean, it's bad because they're Nazis. But in terms of electoral victory, yeah, it's an okay victory. The problem is they don't have a majority. The problem is, however, that there needs to be a coalition for a government to form. Because the liberal and conservative parties, they have a pretty good majority. And yet, it's very possible that if all of the left-wing parties somehow merge together with the Communist Party, the communists could be in charge. So in order to form a coalition government, in order for these liberals and conservatives to not have the communists in power, they're going to form a coalition with the Nazis. The Nazis are going to become a major political force as a result of this coalition being formed. Eventually, Hitler is going to be appointed chancellor, basically the prime minister of this German Reichstag. But even still, he doesn't have absolute power until one night in 1933, the German parliament building goes up in flames. Now, it's not really clear who did this. Some historians speculate that the Nazis intentionally set this fire up. But it's not the Nazis who are blamed, it's the communists. So, in reaction to the Reichstag fire, we are going to see the outlawing of left-wing parties and more power being solidified in the hands of Hitler, the chancellor. And this is going to be expressed in the Enabling Acts. The Nazis become the only legal party. Hitler assumes dictatorial powers, and he is promising to bring Germany towards a new empire, a Third Reich. So how do the Nazis solidify their power? Well, the Nazis are going to have absolute control over all institutions in Germany. They are an example of totalitarianism. Socially, they are going to form organizations, youth organizations, to replace the Boy Scouts, for example, things like Hitler Youth, and you can guess who they're solely dedicated to. They are going to control education. Censorship especially becomes a major way of expressing social dominance. We're going to see political offices being filled with Nazis. Nazis absolutely direct every institution in Germany. We're going to see massive state propaganda campaigns, especially through things like the Nuremberg rallies. These are going to be huge rallies attended by thousands of Nazi supporters. And they're all flocking to hear their leader, Hitler. The Nazis are going to consolidate this political power, as I said, through things like the Enabling Act, but they're also going to secure their political position through the creation of a new secret police, the Gestapo, which roughly translates to secret police. So the Gestapo is going to be a major way to enforce absolute control of the Nazis over German governments. They're going to arrest communists, throw them into concentration camps. First, they came for the communists, if you know the famous poem. On top of this, the Nazis are going to initiate a sort of purge of their own leadership, of the more quote-unquote left-leaning parts of the Nazi party in the Night of the Long Knives. We are going to see the execution of former Nazi party supporters in this event. And again, absolute unquestionable power in the hands of the Führer, of Hitler. The Nazis are also going to start imposing their vision of racial superiority through new racial laws. We are going to see this legal definition of Aryans versus Jews. You have to be registered with the government. If you are a Jewish person, you have to wear a Star of David. Jews are going to eventually be excluded from public institutions. They're going to be excluded from educational institutions. They're barred from going to public spaces like swimming pools. Jews are forbidden from marrying, don't swap me. They are forbidden from marrying Aryans. And yet, until 1938, largely this is the extent of Nazi prejudice. Obviously, things are terrible for Jews. But it's going to get very violent in 1938 when we have an event known as Kristallnacht. This is going to be a mass rally organized not so secretly by the Nazis. And we're going to have Nazi supporters going to Jewish businesses, Jewish synagogues, burning down these places where Jews live and work, where they live, they pray, and they work. And who's blamed for all of this? Well, it's not only the communists who are rabble-rousing, oh, we need to lock up more people, but it's also Jews. We're going to start to see Jews being sent to concentration camps, Jews being sent into ghettos, walled off areas in cities. And we'll talk more about the more dead Nazi policies in our 12th chapter. But all the while, Hitler is remilitarizing Germany. He is making Germany a political force to be reckoned with again. He is building up the German military, and he is looking to expand what he considers rightful German territory. So you should be able to identify why fascism was appealing following the First World War. And I also want you to consider this question right here. Could fascism be appealing today? Could it happen here? So a bit of a bummer of a presentation overall. Trust me, it's going to get a lot worse. But that was a very important chapter. I hope you learned something. Please watch the videos at the end. I did have a discussion of a certain video in class of that Tomorrow Belongs to Me clip. So look at that. That's an example of that German nationalism and how it appeals to different groups of people. But thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed Harold's cameo. Have a great day or night. Do whatever you want. Well, not whatever you want. Well, I really should stop recording.